In moments of anger, Steve Jobs was highly critical of Tim Cook, says biographer Walter Isaacson. This is via CNBC. Walter Isaacson was the guy who wrote the biography on Jobs and released it just like shortly after Steve Jobs passed away. He was like running these interviews as Steve's illness was progressing, Walter Isaacson. And it was his book that led a lot of people to sort of criticize Jobs' behavior and think of him not in the greatest light from a personality perspective, that he was hard to work with, that he's hard on people and things like this. Maybe not the greatest father, all this criticism. Everything came out of that book where it was sort of the most candid that Jobs had been, knowing that he was at the end of his life, that he kind of was a little bit more loose-lipped as far as what he's willing to say. And so, as you know, Johnny Ive recently left Apple. It brought this huge conversation about the future of Apple, the history of Apple, and sort of the key to Apple's magic and success up until this point. And there was some speculation that possibly Johnny Ive and Tim Cook weren't syncing up. Of course, Johnny Ive, the designer behind most of the products that Steve also gets credit for, Steve Jobs. And so there's this rumor that Tim was never really a product guy, that he never visited the design studio, that he's more interested on the back end type working, sales figures, things like this, that was more his mindset. And so Isaacson has come out and said that it goes a bit deeper than that, and essentially that Steve kind of knew what the limitations of Tim's personality or Tim's vision were. So on the record, because Isaacson softened up the story in the book to be nice to people, according to himself, on the record, Steve said, Tim Cook can do everything. Then he looked at me and said, Tim's not a product person. So he contradicted himself immediately. So Steve seemed to know, and I mean, apparently off the record, he was even a little bit more harsh, according to Walter Isaacson. So this kind of points in a similar direction to the speculation around the Ive-Cook relationship and why they may have not necessarily gotten along and why Ive may have checked out a little bit in the absence of Jobs. According to Isaacson, Jobs was in a design studio every day, stressing over minor details every day. He would kick people out, close the door. It was intense. You know, he was an intense guy, a different type of leadership, a different type of individual from Cook. Now, it's important to note that Jobs was part of the group that selected Cook to be the future CEO of the company. Maybe he thought even with that shortcoming in that department, he would still be the best CEO. He maybe thought that, or maybe other people persuaded him. It's hard to know for certain. But for me, when I read something like this and I sort of attempt to imagine the environment that would have existed pre-iPhone, the intensity that I've seen Jobs speak with in interviews, you can't help but envision an environment in which Steve is there, Johnny's there, they're in this design lab, they're talking about iPods, they're getting motivated, they're getting amped, and they're thinking about changing the world, or they're thinking about big picture stuff, and they're doing so in a passionate kind of manner with a certain type of energy. That's going to be hard to maintain. It's going to be hard to continue with a different group of individuals. And so when people on either side of the conversation say, okay, Apple's different now that Steve is gone, Apple's different now that Johnny's gone, it'll never be the same, they'll never be as successful, or they'll never be as imaginative or whatever. But I think people go extreme in that department. There's a lot of people at the company, but I think there is something to it. I think there was a certain type of electricity there, a certain type of intensity and interest there from a couple of guys who were really obsessed over the product and the customer, and not so much the business and the supply chain and some of the elements that Tim seems to be more interested in. Now, I'm sure Tim would disagree with a lot of this, And I have no idea why Isaacson is out talking about this right now at this moment. Possibly because of the Johnny Ive situation, probably because of the Johnny Ive situation. But I don't think Apple will ever be the same Apple. I think it's impossible when you lose personalities like that. It doesn't mean they're going to fail. It doesn't mean they're going to implode. It's just some personalities are tough to replace, as far as I can tell.